Story 1. The farmhouse at the end of the road. My name is Olivia. I'm 31 now, but this happened when I was 27 and had just started my career as a wildlife photographer. I specialized in capturing images of natural landscapes and wildlife in remote areas, which often meant traveling to isolated locations and staying in rural accommodations. In the fall of 2019, I booked a 2-week stay at a farmhouse in a remote part of Montana. The property was listed on a vacation rental site as a photographer's paradise, with sprawling views of mountains, forests, and meadows. The nearest town was about 40 minutes away by car, and the house itself was at the end of a long, private road. From the listing photos, the farmhouse looked charming. A 2-story white structure with a wraparound porch, surrounded by fields and backed by forest. It was perfect for my needs, offering both comfort and the isolation necessary for wildlife to approach within photographing distance. When I arrived after a long drive, it was late afternoon, and the autumn sun was already beginning to set behind the mountains. The farmhouse looked much like the photos, a bit more weathered perhaps, but still charming in that rustic way. An older woman named Margaret met me at the property. She explained that she lived in town but managed the property for the owners, who were rarely there. "It's all yours for the next 2 weeks," she said, handing me the keys. "There's a landline in the kitchen since cell service is spotty. If you need anything, just call the number on the fridge." Before leaving, she added something that struck me as odd. "Stay in after dark. The wildlife gets active, and it's easy to get turned around in these fields at night." It seemed like reasonable advice for an unfamiliar rural area, so I nodded and thanked her. She drove away, her car disappearing down the long driveway, and suddenly I was completely alone. The first few days were productive and peaceful. I would wake early, spend the day exploring the surrounding areas, photographing birds, deer, and the occasional fox. In the evenings, I'd review my shots, prepare a simple dinner, and turn in early to be ready for the morning light. On the 4th night, I was awakened around 2 a.m. by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was a repetitive creaking, almost like footsteps on the old wooden floors, but with an unnatural rhythm. I lay still, listening intently. The noise seemed to be coming from the porch, circling around the perimeter of the house. I told myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps an animal on the porch. But after about 5 minutes of the continuous sound, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the window that overlooked the front porch. Pulling back the curtain just an inch, I peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the property. The porch appeared empty, but as I was about to turn away, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the field about 50 yards from the house. It was difficult to make out details at that distance and in that light, but it appeared to be a person, standing completely motionless, facing the house. They were tall and thin, dressed in what looked like dark clothing. I couldn't discern any features, just a silhouette. I pulled the curtain closed, my heart racing. Who would be standing in a field at 2 a.m., staring at the house? I considered calling the emergency number Margaret had left, but it seemed like an overreaction. There had been no overtly threatening behavior, just someone standing on the property. I decided to check the doors and windows, make sure everything was locked, and return to bed. As I moved through the dark house, I heard the creaking sound resume on the porch. This time, it was clearly footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving past the windows. I froze in the living room, afraid to approach any of the windows. The footsteps continued around the entire perimeter of the house, as if someone was systematically checking each possible entrance. When they reached the back door, the handle rattled quietly, as if someone was testing it. Finding it locked, the footsteps continued. For nearly an hour, this pattern continued, footsteps circling the house, occasionally stopping to test a door or window. I remained in the living room, my phone clutched in my hand, though I had no service, the landline too far away in the kitchen to reach without potentially being seen through a window. Finally, the sound stopped. I waited another 20 minutes before cautiously approaching a window to look out. The field was empty now. No sign of the figure I had seen earlier. I spent the remainder of the night in the living room, too frightened to return to the bedroom with its multiple windows. At first light, I ventured outside to look for evidence of the night visitor. What I found sent a chill down my spine. All around the house, in the soft earth near the foundation, were footprints. They formed a perfect circle around the entire structure, as if someone had walked the perimeter repeatedly. Even more disturbing, at several points near windows and doors, the earth was disturbed in a way that suggested someone had stood there for extended periods looking in. But the most unsettling discovery was what I found at the back door, scratches on the wood around the lock, as if someone had been trying to get in. I immediately packed my essential belongings and drove to town. I found Margaret at the address listed on the rental information and told her what had happened. Her reaction was not what I expected. "You saw them then," she said quietly. "The Watchers." She explained that the property had a strange history. The original owners had died under mysterious circumstances in the 1950s, found locked inside the house, yet displaying signs of exposure, as if they had been outdoors in freezing weather. Since then, there had been reports from various occupants of figures standing in the fields at night, watching the house. "Most people never notice them," Margaret said. "They come and go for a few nights, then disappear for months or years. They've never hurt anyone that we know of. They just watch." I asked why this information wasn't disclosed to renters. She looked uncomfortable. "The owners don't believe the stories. They think it's just local superstition, and frankly, it's hard to rent the place out as it is, being so isolated." I ended my stay early, forfeiting my payment for the remaining days. Before leaving town, I did some research at the local historical society. What I discovered made me grateful for my decision to leave. The property had been the site of not just one tragedy, but several over the decades. Beyond the mysterious deaths of the original owners, there had been a disappearance in 1978. A photographer, like myself, who had rented the property for a month and vanished during his stay, his equipment found neatly arranged in the house as if he had just stepped out. The most recent incident had been in 2014, when a family renting the house for a summer retreat had fled in the middle of the night, claiming they had been surrounded by figures standing in the fields, watching the house for 3 consecutive nights. According to their report, on the 3rd night, the figures had approached the house and attempted to enter. I never returned to that part of Montana, and I now research properties much more thoroughly before renting isolated accommodations. I still don't know who or what was circling the farmhouse that night. Were they people with some unknown purpose? Was it some kind of local harassment tactic to scare away outsiders? Or was it something else entirely? Something connected to the land and its tragic history? All I know is that sometimes isolation isn't peaceful. It's simply a measure of how far away help is when you need it, and that the darkest nights are the ones where you realize you're not as alone as you thought you were. Story 2. The Hunting Cabin. My name is Tyler. I'm 34, and I've been an avid hunter since I was a teenager growing up in rural Pennsylvania. I come from a family where hunting isn't just a hobby. It's a tradition passed down through generations, almost a way of life. This experience occurred 5 years ago, during deer season in late November. I had recently purchased a hunting property and about 80 acres of woodland with a small basic cabin that had been built in the 1970s by the previous owner. The property was in a particularly remote area, accessible only by a dirt road that became nearly impassable in heavy rain or snow. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and the closest town was a good 30-minute drive. The cabin itself was simple. One main room with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder. It had propane for the stove and heater, a hand-pumped well for water, and a gas generator for the few electrical needs. It was primitive but comfortable enough for hunting trips. That November, I planned a 5-day solo hunting trip. My wife wasn't thrilled about me going alone. She preferred I hunt with a buddy. But my usual hunting partners couldn't get the time off work. I assured her I'd be fine. I was experienced in the outdoors and knew the property well after several day trips throughout the year. I arrived at the cabin on a Monday afternoon, unloaded my gear, and spent a couple of hours setting up. By evening, I had everything ready for an early start the next morning. After a simple dinner, I planned my route for the hunt, studied topographical maps of the area, and turned in early. The first odd thing I noticed was around 2 a.m. when I woke to the sound of movement outside the cabin. This in itself wasn't unusual. Deer, raccoons, and other wildlife were common, but this sounded different, more deliberate, heavier. It sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I lay still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and measured, not the quick movements of a startled animal. They made a complete circuit around the cabin, then stopped at the front door. I heard what sounded like sniffing, as if something was scenting the air around the doorframe. My first thought was that it might be a bear. Black bears were common in the area, and they sometimes investigated cabins looking for food. I had been careful to secure all food items inside, but bears can be persistent. I reached for my flashlight and gun, which I kept next to my sleeping bag, ready to make noise to scare it off if necessary. Before I could do anything, the doorknob began to turn. It rotated fully, but the door was locked and didn't open. Then came a sound that sent ice through my veins. 3 distinct knocks on the door. Deliberate, controlled, and undeniably human. No bear or woodland creature would knock on a door. Someone was out there, in the pitch black, miles from the nearest residence, trying to get into my cabin at 2 a.m. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. No response. Just silence. "I'm armed," I added, which was true. "State your business." Still nothing. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from the door and circling the cabin again. I got up and moved to the window, keeping to the side to avoid being seen. The night was overcast, with no moonlight, making it nearly impossible to see anything beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. I considered my options. I could stay put and hope whoever it was would leave. I could try to scare them off with warning shots. Or I could attempt to leave, though driving the rough road in darkness would be dangerous. And if someone was out there, I'd be vulnerable while getting to my truck. I decided to wait it out. I kept my shotgun ready and turned on the gas lantern for light. I wasn't going back to sleep anyway. For the next hour, I heard occasional movements outside, footsteps in the dry leaves, the sound of something brushing against the exterior walls, more sniffing at the windows and door, but no further knocking, no calls or attempts to communicate. Around 3:30 a.m., the noises stopped. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Eventually, the sky began to lighten with pre-dawn, and I cautiously looked out each window. There was no one visible, and my truck appeared untouched. When full daylight came, I went outside to investigate. What I found was disturbing. All around the cabin were footprints in the soft earth. Human footprints from what appeared to be bare feet. They circled the entire cabin multiple times, with clear marks where someone had stood for extended periods by each window. But the strangest detail was that alongside the human prints were animal tracks, specifically what looked like canine tracks, but much larger than any dog or wolf I'd ever seen. These animal tracks perfectly shadowed the human footprints, as if a person and a large canine had walked together around my cabin. I took photos of the tracks with my phone, then decided to cut my hunting trip short. As I was packing up, I heard a distant howl from the forest, not like a normal wolf howl, but elongated and somehow distorted, ending in what sounded almost like laughter. I left within the hour, driving perhaps faster than was safe on the rough road. When I got home, I showed the photos to a friend who worked as a game warden. He was puzzled by the tracks, confirming that the canine prints were unusually large, but otherwise appeared to be wolf tracks. As for the human footprints, He had no explanation for why someone would be barefoot in the woods in late November, when temperatures dropped below freezing at night. 2 weeks later, I returned to the cabin with 2 friends, determined not to be chased off my own property. We found no further signs of intrusion, but the locals at the nearest town offered some unsettling context when I described what had happened. According to several old-timers at the local diner, that area had long been associated with strange occurrences. They spoke of an old legend about wolf walkers, individuals who allegedly had the ability to commune with wolves and would travel with them through the forests at night. Most dismissed these as backwoods superstitions, ghost stories meant to keep people off private land or scare children from wandering too far. But one elderly man took me aside and spoke more seriously about the history of the region. He claimed that in the 1940s, a reclusive family had lived in those woods, rumored to practice some kind of nature-based religion. They were eventually driven out by suspicious locals after several disappearances in the area, but legends persisted that their descendants still returned to their ancestral lands, particularly during the late autumn months. They don't much like new folks claiming their territory, the old man told me, especially hunters. They consider those animals their kin. I've returned to the cabin many times since then, but never alone. I installed better locks, motion sensor lights, and trail cameras around the property. The cameras have occasionally captured images of wolves, larger than typical for the region, but definitely wolves, passing through the area at night. But they've never again recorded any bare human footprints walking alongside them. I still hunt that land, but with a newfound respect for the wilderness and its mysteries, and on particularly quiet nights, when the wind dies down and the forest falls silent, I sometimes hear that distinctive howl in the distance, not quite animal, not quite human, and I make sure all my doors and windows are securely locked before darkness falls completely. Story 3. The Scarecrow Field. I'm Emma, 26 years old, and until recently, I worked as a freelance photographer specializing in rural landscape photography. My work often took me to remote areas seeking unique perspectives on farmland, historical barns, and the generally fading aesthetic of America's agricultural heartland. This incident occurred about 2 years ago in a rural part of eastern Nebraska. I was working on a photo series focusing on traditional farming practices and had been driving the back roads looking for interesting subjects. It was late September, harvest season, and the fields were a patchwork of gold and brown under wide blue skies. Late in the afternoon, I spotted an interesting old farm from the road. A weathered red barn, a modest farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and expansive cornfields stretching toward the horizon. What caught my eye specifically was a field adjacent to the corn that contained dozens of scarecrows, arranged in neat rows. From a distance, they appeared to be traditional scarecrows, burlap-headed figures dressed in old clothes, mounted on wooden crosses. But there were so many of them, far more than any farm would practically need. They created a striking visual against the setting sun, and I immediately pulled over, hoping to capture some shots before losing the golden hour light. There was no fence or no trespassing sign visible, so I grabbed my camera equipment and walked toward the field. As I approached, I noticed some unusual details about the scarecrows. They weren't the haphazard constructions you typically see, mismatched clothing stuffed with straw. These were meticulously crafted, with carefully stitched burlap heads featuring detailed facial features, eyes, noses, and mouths created with black thread. Each wore complete outfits that seemed era-specific, some in overalls and flannel reminiscent of the 1950s, others in more modern clothing. Most unsettling was their arrangement. They were positioned in a perfect grid pattern, each facing the same direction, toward the farmhouse, and spaced exactly the same distance apart. There had to be at least 50 of them, creating a silent audience in the field. I started taking photos, first from the edge of the field, then moving carefully between the rows. The quality of light was perfect, creating long shadows behind each figure that stretched across the recently harvested soil. I became so absorbed in getting the right angles that I didn't notice the time passing until the light began to fade significantly. As I was preparing to leave, I heard the sound of a door closing. Looking toward the farmhouse, I saw an elderly man standing on the porch, watching me. Feeling a bit embarrassed for not having asked permission, I waved and began walking toward the house to introduce myself and explain my presence. As I approached, I called out, "Hello there. I'm so sorry for trespassing. I'm a photographer working on a Rural America series, and your scarecrow field is absolutely fascinating." The man remained silent, watching me with an unreadable expression. He was thin and weathered, dressed in overalls and a flannel shirt not unlike some of the scarecrows wore. When I reached the edge of the porch, he finally spoke. "You shouldn't be in that field after sundown," he said, his voice surprisingly soft for his aged appearance. "I apologize," I replied. "I lost track of time." The lighting was so beautiful, and your scarecrows are unlike anything I've seen before. Did you make them all yourself? He seemed to consider whether to answer me, then nodded slowly. "Been making them for 60 years, one for each harvest." That explained the different clothing styles, I thought. They're really remarkable craftsmanship. May I ask why so many? Most farms just have one or two. His eyes, which had been assessing me with what seemed like caution, now took on a distant look. "They're not for the crows," he said simply. Before I could ask what he meant, a woman's voice called from inside the house. "Gerald, who are you talking to?" The man, Gerald, turned slightly toward the door. Photographer, looking at the field. A moment later, an elderly woman appeared in the doorway. She took one look at me, then at the darkening sky, and a flash of alarm crossed her face. "You need to leave," she said urgently. "Right now. Get in your car and go." Her tone was so insistent that I took an involuntary step back. "I'm sorry if I've disturbed you." "I can delete the photos if—" "Keep the photos. Just go," the woman interrupted. "It's not safe here after dark." "Not in that field." Gerald nodded in agreement. "They'll be turning soon," he added cryptically. Something in their manner, not threatening, but genuinely concerned, made me decide not to argue. I thanked them and began walking back to my car, which was parked about 100 yards down the road. As I walked, I heard the woman speaking urgently to Gerald behind me, though I couldn't make out the words. The sun had now dipped below the horizon, leaving only a fading glow in the western sky. As I passed the edge of the scarecrow field, a sudden gust of wind swept across the open space, causing the figures to sway slightly on their posts. That's when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. In the deepening twilight, it appeared that some of the scarecrows had changed position. The ones in the back row, furthest from the road, no longer faced the farmhouse. They were now oriented in my direction. I told myself it was a trick of the fading light, or that the wind had twisted them on their supports. I quickened my pace nonetheless, an unexplainable sense of dread building within me. Halfway to my car, I heard a sound from the field, a dry, creaking noise, like wood under strain. Against my better judgment, I turned to look. In the dim light, I could make out movement among the rows of scarecrows. It wasn't just the wind making them sway. They were turning, all of them, row by row, pivoting to face the road, to face me. I broke into a run, fumbling for my car keys. Behind me, the creaking grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like the rustling of straw and fabric in motion. I didn't look back again until I reached my car. When I did, what I saw still haunts my dreams. The scarecrows were no longer on their posts. The field appeared empty of its silent sentinels, just bare crosses standing in rows. But at the edge of the field, dark shapes were moving, dozens of them, shambling forward with stiff, uneven gaits, their burlap faces still visible, but now animated with a terrible purpose. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as the rural road would safely allow. In my rearview mirror, I could see the shapes reach the edge of the road, stop, and stand watching as I fled. They didn't pursue beyond the boundaries of the farm, but they remained there, a silent crowd in the gathering darkness. When I reached the nearest town, I was still shaking. I checked into a motel and spent hours examining the photos I had taken. Most showed just what I had seen initially: creepy but inanimate scarecrows in a field of sunset. But the last few images, taken as the light was fading, contained something disturbing. In each successive photo, the scarecrows in the background appeared to be in slightly different positions. Their heads turned just a few degrees more toward the camera, though I hadn't noticed it at the time. The final image, taken moments before I spotted Gerald on the porch, showed a scarecrow in the foreground that I could swear had its head tilted at an angle I hadn't arranged for the shot. Its stitched face, previously expressionless, now seemed to contain a subtle but unmistakable smile. I never returned to that farm, though I did some research from the safety of my home. County records showed the property had been in the same family for generations. Local news archives revealed a disturbing pattern. Every few years, there were reports of hikers or travelers who went missing in that area. The disappearances always occurred in autumn, around harvest time. Most unsettling was an old newspaper article from 1954 that I found in the digital archives. It detailed how Gerald, presumably the same man I met, though much younger then, had been the sole survivor of a harvest accident that claimed the lives of several farmhands. The article was vague about the nature of the accident, but mentioned that the bodies were never recovered. That autumn marked the beginning of the scarecrow tradition on the farm, according to locals, quoted in later human interest stories about the Scarecrow Man and his unusual field. I've given up landscape photography in favor of urban environments with plenty of people and streetlights, and I've learned to respect rural traditions and boundaries, understanding that some practices aren't merely superstition, but serve as warnings or containment for things outside our understanding. Sometimes in my dreams, I still see those burlap faces turning toward me in the twilight, their stitched mouths widening into grins as they step down from their crosses. And I wonder how many travelers have contributed to the harvest over the years, becoming part of the silent congregation that stands guard over that Nebraska field.